As long as he could remember, Roberto had lived in an orphanage with his younger sister Felicity. He didn't remember his parents, but sometimes he recalled a large house with beautiful paintings and a huge white grand piano in the living room. Roberto even saw it in his dreams, but when he talked about it to the caregivers, they just laughed at his fantasies. "You couldn't have lived in such a rich house. It's just dreams," they said. "Poor orphans don't come to us from luxurious mansions. Children of wealthy parents are pampered and never leave the house without a bodyguard." Roberto would only sigh when he heard these words, but the beautiful, bright house stayed in his mind. Roberto had another peculiar trait that set him apart from ordinary children. When he and his sister were brought to the orphanage, he was tightly holding a black violin case. He held it so tightly that the caregivers barely managed to take it from him. It was as if Roberto was afraid to sever the last thread connecting him to his past. The violin was quite ordinary, as was the case. The orphanage workers tried in vain to find a note or other traces that might help them locate the children's parents. Roberto and Felicity arrived at the orphanage very dirty, and they had scratches on their bodies. The workers decided that the children had been through a lot before they came to them. At first, the boy, who was 6 at the time, was so frightened that he hardly left the room and didn't speak to anyone. Roberto sat on the windowsill all the time, as if expecting someone to come for him. But when asked about his parents, he couldn't answer anything. "Did your parents hurt you?" the caregiver asked Roberto, but he only shook his head. "Then where did you get these bruises?" she continued to inquire. Roberto silently shrugged, and no one knew whether he had truly forgotten or just didn't want to talk. It was impossible to get anything out of him. His sister Felicity, who was only 4, slept most of the time, and when she woke up, she wouldn't let anyone but her brother near her. Roberto fed her with a spoon himself and told her fairy tales that he apparently heard from their parents. Thus, several months passed. The caregivers had lost all hope that Roberto and Felicity's parents would come for them. They had become attached to the children, especially to Roberto, who took out his violin every evening and played beautiful, sad melodies for a long time. The women were amazed that a boy so young could play the instrument so masterfully. They secretly cried, wiping their eyes with handkerchiefs, because Roberto's music touched their hearts. "Who taught you to play the violin?" asked his favorite caregiver, Laura. "I don't remember," he admitted, and it was the honest truth. Roberto remembered nothing about his life before the orphanage. Apparently, the previous events had been so traumatic for him that his memory refused to revisit the past to avoid painful memories. But it seemed that playing the violin comforted and calmed the boy, giving him a sense of security in a difficult situation. Time went by. The boy grew up and continued to improve his skills, playing every evening. He and Felicity were gradually getting used to the orphanage and the caregivers. Of course, it wasn't always smooth sailing. Roberto sometimes had conflicts with other kids who called him a sweet boy and envied him because the adults liked him. Sometimes they cornered him to scare him, but they didn't dare to hit him. The caregivers would notice the bruises. Roberto endured the boy's threats and taunts, knowing that his best friend, the violin, would never betray him and would always be by his side. However, one day, one of the boys hid it from Roberto. That's when the boy lost his temper. No one had ever seen him in such a rage. Roberto threw pillows and chairs, stomped his feet, and yelled loudly. The boys scattered in fear. The orphanage staff came running at the noise and screams. Seeing Roberto in such a state, they were extremely astonished. Attempts to calm the boy were unsuccessful. He wouldn't let anyone near him. Finally, Roberto shouted, "Give me back my violin." Only then did the caregivers understand the cause of the boy's tantrum. Laura stayed with Roberto while the other women found the boys, scolded them, and made them return the violin. Terrified, the boys immediately brought back the instrument, and no one bothered Roberto again. His life became more or less peaceful. However, his sister often came to him for help. She lived separately in the girls' room and was also often teased. This upset Felicity greatly, and she secretly dreamed of running away from the orphanage. But Roberto didn't support her idea. Out there, we're not needed by anyone, the boy said reasonably, because we're just children. Wait until I turn 18, then I can live on my own and work. And I'll take you away from here. Felicity sobbed. But there are still 8 whole years until you turn 18, she exclaimed. I can't wait that long. Roberto gently stroked her hair. It's okay, you'll have to be patient. Maybe some nice people will adopt you. Only me? Felicity asked fearfully. What about you? Roberto shrugged. I want our real parents to come for us. Felicity began to cry. Then Roberto would hug her and whisper, I do too. However, deep down, he knew that was impossible. He didn't remember where he knew it from, but for some reason, he was sure of it. Every year, it became more unbearable for Felicity in the orphanage. The other girls still didn't accept her. They laughed at her curls, freckles on her nose, and awkward figure. Felicity cried more and more often. She had trouble falling asleep and ate almost nothing. Most of the time, Felicity sat in some corner where no one could find her. She played with her favorite toy, a plush rabbit, or read books. One early morning, while the girl was sleeping in the dormitory, her roommates flung the window open, then pulled off her blanket and tied her to the bed with ropes made from an old sheet. Felicity woke up from the cold but couldn't move. She tried desperately to free herself, but it turned out the girls knew how to tie very tight knots. Eventually, Felicity caught a severe cold. At first, the caregivers didn't pay much attention to her illness. They didn't call a doctor, just isolated Felicity from the others and gave her warm drinks and herbal infusions to calm her cough. However, the girl kept getting worse and worse. Laura was the first to become worried and called a doctor. Felicity was diagnosed with a fairly advanced case of pneumonia. Exposure to the cold and general weakness from constant stress had taken their toll. Felicity needed serious treatment, which required money. When Roberto found out about this, he was very scared and upset. He had no idea what to do or how to help his sister. The boy was terrified of losing the only person in the world who was dear to him. I have to earn money for the treatment, but how? The boy thought. As usual in such a situation, he took out his violin to calm down. Glancing at the instrument, he suddenly had an idea. He immediately ran to Laura and told her about it. Laura listened attentively to the boy. Yes, I think we can arrange that, she said thoughtfully. But are you sure it will work? And are you ready for this mentally? There will be a lot of people there. The boy nodded fervently. Anyway, I'll try. And that's better than doing nothing. Laura, of course, agreed with Roberto. She promised to go to the orphanage director right away and arrange everything. At first, the headmistress didn't particularly like Roberto's idea, but the gentle and sensible Laura managed to persuade her. All right, the lady agreed. I'll let you do it. But only if you take full responsibility for the boy. Laura promised her she would. Early the next morning, she and Roberto were already standing fully dressed at the orphanage exit. Roberto wore his best white shirt and black pants with suspenders. In his hands, he held a case with his beloved violin. Are you ready? Laura asked, adjusting her hat, and the boy resolutely nodded in response. They left the building and headed to the station, as the orphanage was located out of town. The walk wasn't far, and Laura and Roberto passed the time by giving each other riddles. Then Laura told the boy about her childhood, which was also spent in an orphanage. Roberto was surprised. He didn't know Laura was an orphan like him. It's a shame I was born so late, the boy said. I would have adopted you. Hearing these words, Laura laughed, but she was very pleased. I would gladly be your daughter, Roberto, but alas, it's impossible. The boy sighed. Sometimes the best people have the hardest lives, he noted philosophically, and Laura nodded in agreement. Finally, they reached the station, and the young woman bought tickets for the train. Roberto looked out the window the whole way. He was very nervous. Once again, like in his early childhood, he clutched the violin case tightly in his hands. Finally, they arrived at the main city station. There they stood in the central square, and Roberto took the violin out of its case. He began to play, while Laura walked around the station square with a hat, collecting coins and bills. Many people stopped to listen to the wonderful, touching melodies the boy played. The hat in Laura's hands gradually filled with money. An hour and a half or 2 hours passed, and it was full. The boy had already taken a break once, but was still very tired and hungry. Laura signaled that it was time to finish, and Roberto decided to play a final melody. He chose his favorite piece, very gentle and calm music, and played it with feeling. The boy closed his eyes and didn't immediately notice a man of about 45 stopped nearby. He was tall and handsome, with dark hair streaked with gray. The man had tanned skin, a mustache, and a goatee. His gray eyes looked serious and even stern. The man stared intently at the boy, frowning as if he didn't like what he heard. Roberto noticed the man only when he finished playing. He gasped because the man seemed very familiar. But I couldn't have seen him. I've lived in the orphanage my whole life, the boy thought. Where did you learn that melody? The man suddenly demanded. Who taught you to play it? Roberto was frightened. Why was this man speaking to him this way? Had he stolen someone's music? But he had known it since childhood, and couldn't remember who taught him. I don't remember, the boy stammered, looking helplessly around for Laura. She was already hurrying towards them from the other end of the station square. Excuse me, but you have no right to speak to my charge this way, the young woman said, breathless but firm. Charge, the man repeated, looking at Laura and the hat with money in her hands in confusion. So this boy. I live in an orphanage, Roberto finished for him. The man shook his head and clutched his heart. But you look so much like. He couldn't finish, as if he had lost his strength. Like who? Roberto asked. Who do I look like? But the man didn't answer. Without a word, Laura quickly led the boy to the ticket counters. Roberto resisted. But Laura, this man seems to know my parents. He said I look like someone. We must ask him. But Laura was stubborn. No, Roberto. This man looks very suspicious. You heard how he attacked you over some song. Maybe he's crazy, and he's seeing things. We can't trust anyone. I am responsible for you. Saying this, Laura noticed a free ticket counter and quickly dragged Roberto there. After buying 2 return tickets, the young woman led Roberto to the platform. To her great relief, the train was leaving in 5 minutes. Laura and Roberto got into the carriage, and soon the doors closed. The boy clutched his violin case tightly again, and Laura held the bag with the collected money. There should be enough for Roberto's sister's medicine, she thought happily. But the boy had completely forgotten about the money. He was thinking about the man he had met at the station square. Now Roberto was 100% sure he had seen him before. But it was too late. Fortunately, and to everyone's relief, Felicity quickly recovered. Within a week, she returned to the orphanage. The caregivers realized that the girls she had been living with were treating her cruelly, so they moved her to a room on another floor. There, Felicity immediately made a friend, a modest but cheerful girl named Victoria. Roberto was very happy when his sister told him the news. However, he couldn't stop thinking about the dark-haired gentleman at the train station, and his life was no longer the same. He blamed himself for missing the opportunity to learn something about his parents and his past life. However, his worries were in vain. One afternoon, during their after-lunch rest, Laura knocked on the boy's room door. Roberto, you are being called to the headmistress. Everyone looked at the boy in surprise. Him? To the headmistress? Did he do something wrong? The boys wondered. Are you kidding? Said someone. He's such a goody-goody. The headmistress just wants to hear some music, another boy laughed. The others joined in the joke. Don't forget your instrument, violinist, they all shouted. Roberto silently stood up and walked to the door. Don't pay attention to them, Laura advised, and Roberto nodded in response. However, he was now worried about the same thing. Why had he been summoned to the headmistress? When the boy entered, he noticed that the headmistress was not alone. She had a visitor. When he saw who it was, Roberto gasped. Sitting in the chair opposite the headmistress was the same gentleman from the train station. The boy was taken aback, not knowing what to think or how to act. "Please sit down, Roberto," the headmistress asked gently. The boy sat on a leather couch by the wall. His knees were trembling, and his heart was ready to jump out of his chest. He was very afraid that he would be accused of something. Why else would the stern gentleman from the train station come here? However, in the face of the headmistress, the boy saw neither threat nor anger. On the contrary, she was smiling, and her eyes were shining. "Roberto, please meet Senor Aguilera," the woman said joyfully. "He is a well-known musician and a respected music teacher in the city. He wants to adopt you." Roberto couldn't believe what he heard. He looked from the headmistress to the gentleman and back again. "But what about my sister?" Roberto asked in a trembling voice. "I swore to myself that I would never leave her here alone." The woman smiled kindly at Roberto. "Don't worry about her. Senor Aguilera has expressed his wish to take both of you." The boy felt a weight lift from his heart. He looked again into the stern eyes of Senor Aguilera. "But why us?" Roberto asked. The man hesitated for a moment before answering. It seemed to the boy that the gentleman was somewhere far away in his memories. "I just liked how you play," the man finally said. Roberto felt that this was true, but only partly. He distinctly sensed that there was a mystery behind Senor Aguilera's words. A week later, dressed in their best clothes, Roberto and Felicity stood at the entrance of the orphanage with 2 small bags containing all their few belongings. Exactly at 9 o'clock, a car arrived for them, driven by Senor Aguilera's chauffeur. He opened the back door for the siblings to get in, then easily picked up their bags and placed them in the trunk before taking his seat behind the wheel. Roberto and Felicity watched as the orphanage building slowly receded, feeling a strange mixture of joy and fear. They did not know what awaited them ahead. Felicity had not yet seen Senor Aguilera, but from Roberto's words, she understood that he was not very friendly. She was very afraid that his home would be gloomy and uncomfortable. Moreover, Felicity had just made a friend, and now she was sad to leave her. She promised that if Senor Aguilera allowed, she would visit Victoria. The girl clutched her plush bunny and sighed softly. The journey took over 2 hours. Finally, the car approached a tall fence, behind which a 2-story mansion of gray stone rose among the trees. It made quite an unwelcoming impression, and Roberto felt Felicity shiver as she looked at it. "I don't want to get out of the car. Maybe we should go back? At least we know everything there," the girl whispered. Roberto tried to encourage her, though he himself wasn't sure if they would be happy at Senor Aguilera's. They walked hand in hand along the path. When they approached the house, the door opened, and the housekeeper greeted them. She led them into the living room, and Roberto saw a huge grand piano in it. Just like in my dream, the boy thought. However, the piano wasn't white but black. The kids gazed around the luxurious house with amazement. They had never seen such opulence before. Meanwhile, the housekeeper escorted the children to their rooms. Roberto got a large room with a view of the garden, while Felicity got a smaller room overlooking the forest and distant mountains. Both rooms were bright and very pleasant to be in. "The driver will bring your things soon," said the housekeeper. "Unpack them, and then come down to the kitchen. I'll feed you." The children nodded. "By the way, my name is Senora Marta. I will be taking care of you while Senora Aguilera is away. You can come to me with any questions." The kids nodded again silently. Roberto had 1,000 questions in his head, but he didn't dare to ask them. After unpacking his few belongings and placing his violin case on the table by the wall, the boy went downstairs. Felicity hadn't arrived yet. She was slow and always took her time. But there was already another girl sitting in the kitchen. She was about the same age as Roberto or slightly younger. She had straight chestnut hair with bangs and piercing gray eyes. Just like Señora Aguilera's, thought the boy. Señora Marta was setting the table. Noticing Roberto, she said, "Children, meet each other. This is Cecilia, Señora Aguilera's biological daughter. And this is Roberto, his adopted son." "So, we're brother and sister?" the boy exclaimed in amazement. Cecilia just nodded in response. She cautiously steadied him from under her bangs, unsure if she could trust him. It seemed the girl hadn't fully come to terms with what had happened. Suddenly, she had a brother and sister. However, seeing Felicity, Cecilia thawed a little. A semblance of a smile appeared on her face. Felicity looked at the girl with wide eyes, and hope gleamed in her gaze. She very much wanted to make a friend here in the new house. But Cecilia remained silent, and Felicity was afraid to speak to her first. No one broke the silence while they ate. Roberto thought that Señora Marta cooked much better than the chefs at the orphanage, and this made him very happy. Even Felicity ate everything on her plate, which was a rarity for her. But Cecilia seemed unable to swallow a bite. She pushed her food around with her fork and then left the table. Señora Marta just sighed, watching her leave. "She's always like that, don't pay attention," Marta said quietly after Cecilia left the kitchen. "She won't say a word and doesn't eat anything. Her mother died when she was 5. With these words, Marta threw all of Cecilia's uneaten food into the trash. This surprised Roberto a lot. Felicity was about to ask something about their new sister when suddenly, the sound of music came from the living room. Someone was playing the piano. "Who's playing?" Roberto asked, enchanted. The melody he heard was beautiful, and, besides everything else, he knew it. He had played it on the violin himself. Of course, it's Cecilia. She's been playing the piano since she was 4. She's already a true virtuoso. "Very beautiful," Roberto said quietly, and Felicity agreed with him. The children left the kitchen and went straight to the living room where Cecilia was playing. She didn't notice them because her eyes were closed. This meant the girl was playing the melody from memory. Roberto admired her talent and skill. He suddenly imagined that they could perform this magical melody as a duet, but then he felt embarrassed by his thoughts. "She is the daughter of a rich man, and I am just an orphan from an orphanage," Roberto thought with a sigh. Felicity and Roberto did not disturb the girl and went to their rooms. In the evening, Señora Marta knocked on the boy's door. She said that Señora Aguilera was waiting for him in the living room. For some reason, Roberto took his violin and went downstairs. Señora Aguilera was sitting in a chair by the window. Seeing the boy, he pointed to the chair next to him. Roberto sat down, placing the violin on his lap. "Tell me, please, do you remember anything about your childhood?" Señora Aguilera asked. Roberto just shook his head. "Nothing before I ended up in the orphanage." "And you don't remember the person who taught you to play the violin either?" Roberto just nodded, looking at Señora Aguilera with clear eyes. He hoped that the man would now tell him about his past, but he only frowned. "I only remember a big house with paintings," the boy ventured to say. "And a white grand piano." Señora Aguilera shuddered and gasped. Roberto leaned forward, watching his reaction. Could it be that this wasn't his imagination? Could this house actually exist? But Señora Aguilera quickly composed himself. "Play that melody from the station for me," he calmly requested. Roberto sighed, obediently took the violin from its case, and began to play. He didn't notice Cecilia enter the room. She quietly observed him from under her bangs, and it was impossible to tell what she was thinking. When Roberto finished, Señora Aguilera said, "Cecilia, come closer. Have you met your new brother?" The girl approached and silently nodded. "I want you to start playing together, so you can perform in the talent contest this spring. I think you have every chance to win." Thus Roberto's wish came true. He and Cecilia started rehearsing together every day under the guidance of Señora Aguilera. He usually listened to their playing in silence, occasionally adding comments, but overall, he liked how their duet sounded. As soon as the rehearsal ended, Cecilia would immediately leave for her room or the garden, and Roberto never managed to exchange even a word with her. Sometimes he thought the girl was mute, although he did hear her quiet voice a few times when she answered Senora Marta. Felicity was very bored in Senor Aguilera's house. She wanted to have a friend and constantly asked Roberto if he had made friends with Cecilia yet, but the boy just shook his head every time. One day he was walking in the garden and saw Cecilia. She was sitting by a small pond, feeding the plump carp. Roberto approached. "Hello," he said. The girl flinched in surprise. She thought no one was around. Glancing at Roberto from under her bangs, Cecilia silently nodded to him. "Do you feed them every day?" the boy asked, and Cecilia nodded again. "They're so cute," Roberto continued, squatting down next to the girl. "This one's my favorite," Cecilia said unexpectedly, pointing to the fattest carp. "His name is Senor Amato." Roberto smiled. "Hello, Senor Amato," he said. Cecilia looked at him, and a shadow of a smile flickered across her face. "Do the others have names too?" the boy inquired. Cecilia named each fish in turn. "Wow! How do you not mix them up?" Roberto was amazed, but Cecilia just shrugged in response. They sat by the pond for a long time, and then the boy suggested playing a game. She agreed. They played rock, paper, scissors, word games, and hide and seek. Roberto knew that Felicity would gladly join them now, but he understood that this might scare Cecilia away. He decided it would be better if the girl first began to trust him, and then he could invite his younger sister. So they became friends, and the next day they played together. They had so much fun that Senora Marta couldn't even call them for lunch. Time passed, and the kids got used to their new life in Senor Aguilera's house. They played in the garden or inside the house when it rained, ate delicious food prepared by Marta, and in the evenings, Roberto and Cecilia rehearsed under her father's guidance. Finally, the time for the contest arrived. The kids were very nervous as the driver took them to the city. Roberto felt his knees shaking desperately, and Cecilia's heart was pounding so hard that he could hear it. At last, they arrived at a beautiful building in the city center, where a crowd had already gathered. Senor Aguilera didn't push through the crowd but led the kids to the artist's entrance. He guided them through several long corridors, then they went upstairs and found themselves in a small lobby. Here, a few dressed-up kids were already waiting for the contest to start. Roberto noticed some were holding violin cases. He gripped his so tightly that his knuckles turned white. Senor Aguilera pointed him to the boys' dressing room and took Cecilia to the neighboring room. Roberto entered the dressing room and looked at himself in the mirror. Everything seemed fine. His hair was neatly combed, the white shirt fit perfectly, and the bow tie was in place. Roberto took a deep breath and left the dressing room. Cecilia wasn't there yet. Finally, she appeared before him, and the boy gasped in surprise. The girl was wearing a beautiful white silver dress that shimmered in the sunlight. Her hair was adorned with a shiny star-shaped clip. "You look very beautiful," whispered the enchanted Roberto, and Cecilia blushed. Finally, the competition began. The children were called to the stage one by one, while the rest waited patiently in the hall. The room was filled with an excited buzz. Everyone was sharing their thoughts, hopes, and fears. Only Roberto and Cecilia were silent. The boy noticed that the girl was almost trembling with nervousness, so he stepped closer and took her hand. The girl looked at him gratefully but said nothing. They stood like that, holding hands, until they were called to the stage. Roberto led Cecilia to the exit. Ahead, he saw only the bright light of the spotlights. The boy was surprised when he realized he was hardly nervous. He remembered playing for many people at the train station and felt confident. He was eager to start. He guided Cecilia to a beautiful white grand piano in the middle of the stage and stood beside it, slightly ahead. In a moment, the boy began to play. He heard Cecilia join in. Their melody touched the soul, transporting the audience to an unknown fairy tale world. Roberto completely forgot where he was. He was immersed in the music, merging with it entirely. Suddenly, he felt a jolt and opened his eyes. Something was wrong. He didn't immediately understand what had happened and continued playing his part. The jolt repeated. The melody, which had been flowing smoothly and harmoniously, suddenly crumpled like paper stuck in a drawer. A disappointed sigh swept through the hall. It was as if the audience had been abruptly pulled from a sweet dream. But what had happened? Roberto didn't immediately realize that Cecilia had made two mistakes. It was the false notes that had so sharply jarred his ears. He wanted to turn around and see what had happened, as Cecilia had never made mistakes before, but he couldn't stop and continued to play the melody to the end. Finishing, he bowed deeply. There was applause in the hall, but not the thunderous ovation he had expected. Roberto sighed and turned to the girl. She was still sitting at the piano, her head bowed low. The boy approached and took Cecilia's hand. She looked at him with tear-filled eyes. "It's okay, CEC," Roberto whispered. "You did everything you could." The girl just nodded. Awkwardly standing up, she bowed jerkily and hurried off the stage. The lush skirts of her beautiful dress now hung limply, as if they had lost their former grandeur. "Please, let's go to the car," Cecilia said quietly when they returned to the hall where they had been waiting for their turn. "Don't you want to wait for the contest results?" Roberto asked. Cecilia just shook her head in response. Roberto took her hand again, and they walked to the exit. Senor Aguilera was already waiting for them in the car. He glared at the children as they walked towards him. Roberto noticed Cecilia's shoulders slump in fear of her father. "What happened, Cecilia?" Senor Aguilera asked sternly as soon as the children got into the car. The girl didn't answer. "It was just a small mistake," Roberto answered for her. "It happens to everyone." "It shouldn't have happened to my daughter," Senor Aguilera replied harshly. "Did we practice every evening for nothing?" "But it's not Cecilia's fault," Roberto tried to defend the girl again. "I didn't ask for your opinion," Senor Aguilera cut him off. It was clear he was very angry. Cecilia listened in silence the whole time, shrinking into her seat and staring at the floor. When they arrived home, the girl immediately ran to her room. Since then, something had subtly changed in the house. Senor Aguilera now only worked with Roberto. Cecilia's piano stood untouched. At dinner, Senor Aguilera pretended his own daughter didn't exist. He only talked to Roberto and Felicity. Cecilia became even quieter. She rarely left her room. Roberto was worried about his friend's state but could do nothing. It seemed like Cecilia had lost interest in their old games. One early morning, Roberto was woken by screams. He rushed out of his room and heard Marta's panicked voice. "Cecilia is gone," she was yelling. Roberto ran to the girl's room. Senora Marta was inside. She was pointing to the neatly made bed. Senor Aguilera was there too, silently staring at the girl's pink bedspread, unsure how to react. Roberto ran to the garden. For some reason, he thought the girl might have hidden there. He ran with all his might to the very pond where they had first talked. Even before reaching the place, the boy heard soft splashes. He sped up and reached the pond just as chestnut hair and white girl's hands with thin wrists flashed above the water's surface. Without thinking, Roberto jumped into the water. He didn't know if he could swim, but there was no time to think. The boy dived and saw Cecilia underwater. He wrapped his arms around her waist and surfaced with her. Adults were already rushing to the pond. They helped the children out onto the shore. They gently laid coughing Cecilia on the grass. Senor Aguilera leaned over his daughter, and a tear rolled down his cheek. "Everything will be all right now," repeated the worried Marta soothingly. She clutched her heart and inhaled sharply, as if she had been at the bottom of the pond herself. Felicity was also there, standing off to the side and crying. Fortunately, Cecilia quickly recovered from the incident. By the next day, she was feeling better. Her father now didn't leave her side for a moment. He apologized to his daughter for having behaved so inappropriately, putting the competition above their relationship. Cecilia was calm and even smiled, but there was still fear and sadness in her eyes. Roberto hoped that all this would gradually be forgotten, and that Cecilia would be able to play with him and Felicity again, as before. One day, he heard the sounds of a piano and realized that Cecilia was feeling much better. He knew how important music was in her life, so her return to it greatly pleased the boy. He went down to the living room and listened to the music for a long time. Noticing him, Cecilia smiled. Life in the mansion was gradually getting back to normal. However, Roberto was still tormented by the mystery of his and Felicity's past. One evening, when Senor Aguilera was sitting in the living room with a book, the boy dared to approach him. "Did you want something, Roberto?" his adoptive father asked, looking up from the pages. The boy hesitated for a moment, then decided. "I want to know more about my past, and I think you know something about it," he said quickly. Senor Aguilera took off his glasses, which he wore while reading, and sighed heavily. "Yes, I know something," he said thoughtfully. "But I'm not sure if you're ready to hear it." Roberto sat in a chair next to his adoptive father and exclaimed fervently, "Of course, I'm ready. I must know the truth about myself and Felicity. Please tell me." Then Senor Aguilera put aside his book and glasses and looked at the boy. "All right, I will tell you everything I know. Your mother was my student," he said. "Really?" Roberto couldn't believe his ears. Senor Aguilera just nodded in response, and his eyes grew misty, as if he was wandering far away down the paths of his memory. "I was about 30 at the time, and I had been teaching music for several years. When I first saw Carmen, your mother, I fell in love with her at first sight. She was so graceful that all men watched her with admiration. She had long red hair and the same blue eyes as you. But of course, I never told Carmen about my feelings. It would have been unethical of me. She was learning to play the violin and was a very talented student. About a year after she started her lessons, she was already composing her own melodies. They were magical. Every day, I fell more in love with Carmen, and she felt it. I invited her to concerts and restaurants. We went on trips together, but she kept her distance. To her, I was always just a teacher and an interesting companion, but nothing more. Then she met your future father. He was a wealthy patron who loved music and painting, and he lived in the big, bright house you told me about. So that house really exists? It wasn't a dream? Roberto asked quietly. Of course, it exists, and you remembered it, Senor Aguilera replied. Then he cleared his throat and continued. I won't hide it. It was sad for me to watch your father gently hold Carmen by the waist and see her trustfully lean towards his ear to whisper something. But there was nothing I could do. I saw that they deeply loved each other. I couldn't stand in the way of your parents' happiness, so I stepped aside. I remained Carmen's beloved teacher and good friend. Soon I met Cecilia's mother and married her. A year later, your parents got married, and soon you were born. When you were 3 or 4 years old, Carmen started teaching you to play the violin. It was difficult for you, but your mother was very patient. And her patience paid off. Then Felicity was born, and Carmen became even happier. Everything seemed so cloudless. Having said this, Senor Aguilera sighed heavily. Roberto felt that he was about to hear something tragic. But where are my parents now? What happened to them? He asked, fearing the answer. They died, his adoptive father replied quietly. You were in a car, and there was an accident. The bodies of your parents were found in the wrecked, mangled car. Only you and Felicity survived. Apparently, you and your sister got out of the car and went looking for help, realizing that your parents were not moving. Roberto couldn't believe what he was hearing. His temples began to pound, and blood rushed to his head. Their parents are no longer alive, the same thought kept spinning in his mind. It seems the accident traumatized you so much that you forgot everything, Senor Aguilera concluded. Roberto felt a tear rolling down his cheek. Noticing this, Senor Aguilera took his hand. "I am very sorry," he said. Roberto only sobbed in response. "They were wonderful people," Senor Aguilera continued. "I would give anything to bring them back. When I found out Carmen was gone, I felt like a part of me died with her." He paused for a moment. "Then I learned you were missing. They couldn't find you. And since neither Carmen nor your father had any relatives, there was no one to take care of you." Roberto listened carefully to his adoptive father. "Then I accidentally heard a familiar melody at the train station. I would recognize it among 1,000 others. Your mother composed it. It was her favorite melody. It was born when Carmen fell in love with your father." Roberto sobbed again, and this time Senor Aguilera embraced him like a son. "Of course, I didn't immediately realize you were Carmen's son. I hadn't seen you for a long time, and you had changed with age. At first, I thought you somehow stole my student's melody. But then I connected the dots and realized you were her son. That's when I decided to take you in. I'm sorry I didn't tell you everything right away. I was very afraid of traumatizing you again, and you had already been through so much." Roberto nodded understandingly. "Everything happens in its own time," he replied with a wisdom beyond his years. Since then, Roberto often thought about his parents before going to bed. He tried to imagine them in every detail and then decided to ask Senor Aguilera if he had a photograph of his mother and father. He promised to try to find one. In the evening, his adoptive father brought Roberto a small photo. It depicted a beautiful young woman in a red evening dress, and next to her was a rather attractive young man with curly hair, strikingly similar to Roberto. The boy carefully tucked the photo into his notebook, promising himself he would show it to Felicity when she grew up. The atmosphere in Senor Aguilera's mansion changed after his conversation with Roberto. The boy felt as if the house had become warmer. Now the whole family gathered together in the evenings. They talked, shared news, played board games, solved crosswords, or read books aloud. But most often, Roberto and Cecilia put on impromptu concerts, and Senor Aguilera, Felicity, and Marta became their most devoted listeners. Senor Aguilera increasingly told Roberto and Cecilia that they needed to enter the music academy because both had a talent for music. The kids looked forward to it with hope and anticipation. When they turned 16, the young man and the girl left to study. At the academy, everyone thought they were brother and sister, but unexpectedly, different feelings blossomed between them. Roberto continued to care for and protect Cecilia from everything around, and the girl happily helped him with various subjects that he found difficult. He was entirely absorbed in music. When they graduated from the academy, both were offered positions in the academy orchestra. Thus, Roberto and Cecilia became the youngest musicians there. At the same time, the young man proposed to the girl, and soon they married. Cecilia was the most beautiful bride in the world, and her eyes sparkled like diamonds. Roberto was also very happy. They lived in perfect harmony, traveled on tours together, and were never bored with each other. 2 years after the wedding, Cecilia felt she was expecting a child. A boy was born, and they named him Roberto after his father. He looked a lot like his grandfather, and his fingers were so long and slender that it was immediately clear he would become a musician too. Dear viewers, if you enjoyed the story, please support the video by liking it and leaving a comment. Thank you very much.